Hi everyone, it's Rod TV. I'm Rod, and you have got questions. I have had so many questions about Jacob Zuma and the Constitution and all of those things and what's going to happen. I do remind you, look at episode 1 for my predictions for the year. Episode 10's got a few updates. And once we get past May and we enter into the period I was making predictions about, I'm sure I'll have more to say about all of that. I've also been getting questions about whether I actually do personal readings, and of course I do. So make sure you keep watching to the end, and I'll give you information about how to get hold of me for that. But in the meanwhile, something came up in my chats with everyone online in this last week. And, with all the difficulties that we've been seeing, last week's episode on the bombings and the extreme craziness in the world, making it really hard for people. As we know, something that really disturbs people in South Africa is how not only how the government is behaving, in its selfish ways, but also how that increases the suffering of ordinary people, the very people they should understand are suffering. And it has raised the question of why all the suffering, not only why all the suffering of people in South Africa right now or in the past, but in general, the human issue of suffering. And that's what I just wanted to talk about a little bit today. What do the great masters, what do the great religions, etc., say about this condition of suffering? So, of course, I can only give you my favorite grand masters or philosophies that have really helped me understand this issue. And you may certainly have ideas of your own or other masters or beliefs that you follow. But all I can do is share with you what I've come to understand about this. I mean, certainly one of the things that we see in today's kind of Neoplatonic New Age religion seems to me, the idea that we are seeking a state of peace, harmony, bliss, and revelation on the earth. And that is quite to the contrary of what almost all spiritual and religious beliefs have said before. Even when we start at Plato himself, the unintentional origin of any kind of Neoplatonic philosophy, whether that's, in 300 AD or in the Renaissance period or in the modern period, wherever they may be, Plato himself started off by saying the material world is a flawed replica of the spiritual world. It is a manifestation of the spiritual world, but it is imperfect by virtue of being material. And in many ways, that's where all our philosophies start. No doubt there were thinkers thinking that before Plato's time, but Plato really articulates that and creates much of the foundation for a lot of spiritual philosophy later, including Judeo-Christian philosophy, although parts of that are also older. A lot of how we think is really based on Plato's ideas. But even beyond the Platonic idea of the imperfect world, a spiritual understanding of suffering demands first the acceptance that humans are spiritual beings, that there is a spiritual reality as well as a material reality. That's our starting point. We have to accept that. Otherwise, if you accept an only and completely materialist view of the world that says everything is material, there isn't a spiritual reality, when you die, you're dead and gone, and that's all over, all of those things mean, well, then suffering is clearly just part of the material world, and there isn't a why, because in that worldview, there isn't a why for anything. So, taking the idea that we are spiritual beings, one of the ways that religion has always tried to explain suffering is through the concept of grace. Grace is something bestowed by the divine. So, whether it's a rescue or a relief or a miracle or something that comes seemingly from the divine, that would be grace. So religious philosophies, you see it in Christianity, you see it in some of the Eastern philosophies, have the idea that suffering is actually grace bestowed by God because it is given to you to awaken you. For me, I understand from my various studies of Eastern philosophies, which have strongly influenced my life, that more or less the same idea, suffering is a form of grace. One of the great masters that I've admired for many years is Ram Dass. Most of you know him, formerly an American psychologist by the name of Richard Alpert, joined the spiritual path in the 60s, became Ram Dass, became a great teacher in his own right. But he had a famous great teacher by the name of Maharaj Ji, and Maharaj Ji said, Ram Dass loves quoting him, saying, "I love suffering. It brings me so close to God." Because, of course, it is in our moments of suffering that we reach out. So, not only suffering as grace, but literally suffering as a method or something that forces us to reach towards the divine. We'll see more of that. Ram Dass himself also quotes the famous Russian philosopher Gurdjieff, who says, "There is nothing that can be attained spiritually without suffering in life. You have to suffer to do spiritual work, but to do the work, you must give up suffering." In other words, the identification with suffering. So that's quite a powerful thought, and one which Ram Dass himself lives by, and as we'll see, tries to explain it further. At essence, when you take birth in a body, you identify with this body and you think that this is reality. And that is the source of your suffering, according to Ram Dass and many Eastern masters. If you think that your body is the reality, that is the source of suffering. And ultimately, you suffer because the mind clings to things. It clings to youth. It clings to money. It clings to people. It clings to life itself. Ultimately, it clings to expectations. Expectations create suffering. Ram Dass also goes on to say that the greater problem with suffering is that we fear suffering. So our fear of suffering essentially multiplies our suffering. We're so afraid of looking at it. And he says, look at suffering without averting your gaze. He says we shouldn't close ourselves off to fear, but rather we should open to it. We should sit with our fears. We should allow our fears to rise up and pass on their own. When they rise up, to try and sit with them, to be a little dispassionate, not get caught in the fear and recognize I am fearful and this is my fear. And I will just allow that fear to pass. I will not identify it. Dass says, by simply looking with no push or pull, eventually mindfulness is achieved. So that's just sitting there, acknowledging I fear suffering. I won't identify that. I'll just sit and look at that. And the moment you enter that witnessing state, according to Ram Dass and many of the great masters who recommend that sitting, the moment you enter that witnessing, you loosen the boundaries of the ego and the fear begins to change. And you can discover that the fear that you're looking at, my fear of suffering, is quite different from what it is, the suffering, the very thing that created the fear in the first place. And you begin to realize, oh, so this suffering, this fear is a thing that my mind produces, but it doesn't have a fixed reality. You know, it's bouncing from the suffering to the fear of suffering to all of this fear. And that's why Ram Dass says, don't run away from it. The minute you embrace it and own it as this game of the mind, you become more powerful. One of the great Eastern religions which has articulated this idea of suffering clearly is Buddhism. And it's found in the first noble truth of Buddhism. Now, we know, like any religion, and in fact, like any philosophy, there are endless variations on a theme. I'm not an expert on Buddhism, and I'm speaking, of course, of anything would have to be considered one particular interpretation, but a common interpretation of the first noble truth in Buddhism. So the first noble truth of Buddhism is to recognize that suffering is an unavoidable part of life, because there are four unavoidable sufferings, and they are birth, old age, sickness, and death. Unavoidable, and they all cause suffering. Notice birth in there, because that's our entry into the physical world. It does cause suffering for the one giving birth, and the suffering of the entrance into the material world itself. But suffering is itself both a physical and a mental process. We try and alleviate that suffering by seeking happiness. And the way that we try and seek happiness is through pleasure, or as is often said in Eastern philosophies, through satisfying our senses. But the problem with satisfying our senses is that the result is temporary. If we seek the pleasure of chocolate, and we get ourselves some chocolate, and we have that chocolate, have we satisfied that need? Never need chocolate again. Done my chocolate. It's not how it works. Turns out that if you do that, you end up wanting more chocolate in the long run. And so all our pleasures seek satisfaction through our senses, and our senses are endlessly seeking more of it. So according to that principle of Buddhism, happiness and pleasure are these transient things that we seek to alleviate our suffering. But we end up increasing our suffering because we increase our desires, we increase our expectations, we increase our belief that there should be a particular outcome, and we feel that extreme loss and disappointment when it is loss. Indeed, many philosophers say it is the experience of loss that is the heart of all suffering. And so, in the simplest sense, that experience of loss of pleasure. But of course, in that idea of birth causes suffering, the loss of the awareness of our true self or our true world or our true nature is the first principle that causes suffering. So loss it is. But in the end, the Buddhist philosophy is that because life is imperfect, like Plato said, and changing, and pleasures and happiness are transient, suffering is inevitable. The remaining noble truths in Buddhism go on to show how to attempt to remove yourself from that suffering. And at heart, a spiritual practice, especially one of meditation, is a process by which we start being able to detach from the need for outcomes, from pleasures, as well as giving us the ability to sit at and look at fear without actually engaging with it. One of the most powerful reasons we meditate. And as simple as it sounds, as too simple as it sounds, that is what happens because, as Ram Dass pointed out, that state of awareness, of observing ourselves experience something, dissolves the ego. Powerful trick. Amongst even more modern masters than that, we have the well-known Eckhart Tolle, who wrote a book called The Power of Now some years ago, and from then, developed his spiritual awareness enormously through a profound breakthrough that, of course, arose out of suffering. So Tolle also expresses an important philosophical idea that says that personal suffering provides the intensity needed for a spiritual breakthrough to happen. Awakening comes from a crisis, and usually a crisis of loss. This, of course, is a repeat of the traditional idea that suffering is grace because it offers an opportunity for spiritual breakthrough. So Tolle is saying it's almost like the reason why we suffer is to give us the intense experience that forces us to pursue a spiritual awakening. Why? Because it diminishes our sense of self. In the face of suffering, we feel helpless. We feel powerless. And so we feel that our self is dissolving. Fear increases. But according to Toller, that's the dissolving of the ego. What is dissolving is your image of yourself, the ego self that says it should be like this and I should be okay and everything should be lovely and I should be feeling fine. All of those ideas deny those fundamental human principles that I've expressed that said we know from the beginning the starting point is birth causes suffering. You see that, of course, in the Judeo-Christian idea of the sin of the Garden of Eden and the born in sin idea is that same principle that says we're born suffering because of our material reality, because in it we experience loss, well explained in the story of the Garden of Eden, which is also about the experience of loss and how that produces the suffering of the human race. All our ancestors trying to tell us the same story and trying to tell us how to deal with our suffering. So it is good to lose the ego. It is good to disidentify with the ego, says Toller. When you accept the suffering and the diminishment of the self, humility follows. Saying yes to the death of that self removes what was obscuring the truth of who you are, because you aren't the ego. So the way that the ego dissolves is by being confronted with reality and says, well, that challenges your image of the self. It's the ego who wants the chocolate and the pleasure and the recognition and the happiness, because all of those things in the long run deny a fundamental reality. And that is that they're transient and that they only satisfy the senses. They don't actually alleviate the suffering of life on earth, being a human being. So Toller goes on to say, when you can connect, Toller goes on to say, when who you think you are dissolves, you connect with a vast power, which is the essence of your very being. The same thing as the Buddhists call the deathless realm. Toller was asked in response to that view that is suffering necessary in order to achieve any spiritual enlightenment. And he said, well, actually, if you're drawn to spiritual teachings in the first place, you have probably suffered already. But at the very least, as human beings, we experience collective suffering, and that is driving us towards our spiritual reality. The solution, according to Eckhart Tolle, is to live entirely in the present, because so much of our sense of loss is based on the past or the future. We think about the past, which is itself lost, and whether we have regrets or nostalgia or wishes for something or whatever they may be, it pulls us away from the present, causes us the experience of loss and suffering. And when we project towards what we want or what we haven't got by looking at the future or by what we think is going to happen, we create expectations of various outcomes. We cause more pain for ourselves because we can't perfectly see the future, and we're going to create loss, therefore. Living in the present is the only way to avoid that. And that is something that Ram Dass himself also goes into it. He says that we shouldn't invite suffering into our lives, but when it does come, we must work with it to transform it, not use pleasure to try and avoid it. You know, when we're faced with the suffering of others, we look away because we are afraid to drown in it. But, says Ram Dass, you have to keep your heart open in hell. Because if you close your heart down to anything in the universe, it's got you, and then you are at its mercy. If you turn away from suffering, you close your heart and are at the mercy of suffering. Very powerful thought. So, we've learned that the earth is by its nature a place of suffering. that the causes of suffering can't be eliminated. And that if that's all the case, what is the point? Why do we even live on this earth? The point is that by becoming compassionate and aspiring to non suffering, aspiring to rise above it, to detach from it, we aspire to that true higher self, that true higher nature that is beyond birth. But it's important that we must not aspire to the outcome. We just try and raise our consciousness. It's like, wanting to save the planet is very important as long as we don't expect that the result of that is a saved planet. Because the planet is Earth, and Earth is the place of suffering by design, or however you want to call that. It's imperfect by its nature, and therefore it makes suffering. It is not possible to not have suffering on the earth. That's what we need to accept, and that's why the great masters tell us to realize that our reality is not the earth. So, if the result is not a saved planet, what is it? The result is that acceptance of suffering, the understanding of yourself, and the development of a practice such as meditation, such as facing the suffering of others head on so that you don't experience fear, and therefore such as developing compassion, looking at the suffering of others, and working with the suffering of others, but not aiming towards the outcome. And like that, when you develop the spiritual practice, you develop that first-hand knowledge of that other human reality where suffering does not exist. And that's why we suffer. So let's let go of the urge or the expectation that the earth should be a place of groovy peace and harmony, but continue to work towards that without any expectation. I want to close that with reminding you of Ram Dass's words, who said, if you close your heart down to anything in the universe, it's got you, and then you are at the mercy of suffering. Suffering exists for us to open our hearts and transform ourselves. But a quick astrological question from Cheryl, your question that I want to deal with, because Cheryl sent a very common question and one that astrology is quite good at answering. Cheryl, I have changed your name, but you'll know who you are, because the question was about a relationship that you have been having with someone who seems to be uncommitted, who has assured you that he does have feelings for you and he does love you, is what you said in the email. He's got those feelings, but he's uncertain of himself, and so seems to be avoiding commitment. He comes and goes and those kinds of things. Astrology is really good at looking at what is the nature of the relationship between two people. And Cheryl, when I look at that, it literally says he sees you as a friend, whereas you tend to live on his terms. And in astrological language, that's a clear indication. It's like saying you love him a lot more than he loves you. More importantly, the chart also shows the recent contact that you mentioned to me. It is confirmed, and that he is busy moving on. In the long run, I don't know whether he will return, but I can tell you in the reasonably short run, which is, a year or two, this nearby time, the chart is saying in his pursuit of himself, he has a long journey to take. In the meanwhile, you need to move on with yourself. I don't expect that you will be seeing more of him as a lover, but I do expect that in moving on, you've got a lot further to go than you might have been able to do if you were caught up in a relationship with someone who's still trying to work out even what his feelings are. So move on. If it returns to you in the future, so much the better. But in the meanwhile, you've got great space to cover. Go for it. You're asking me about how to get a personal appointment for a much more detailed reading, whether that's of your chart in your karma or what's happening in your life now or over the next year, just email me at this address, appointment@rodsuskin.com, with the subject line next. Your subject line must be exactly that. The is handled by an automated booking system, and that will reply with a date for a booking within about an hour or so. So give it a shot. And for the rest, I'll be seeing you here next Friday as usual. So don't forget to send me your questions for answering on air, your questions about everything else. Subscribe, share this with your friends, tell them all about this, and I'll see you here next Friday at noon as usual.